Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to my channel. Welcome to another exciting video, where we'll be shedding light on Duncan McNaught. Duncan McNaught LL.D. JP, 1845 1 June 1925 was born in Alexandria, Dunbartonshire in 1845. He was the parochial school teacher at Kilmaurs in East Ayrshire from 1867 and served at the school for over 50 years, having served as assistant from 1865. He founded the Kilmarnock Conservative Association, jointly founded the Robert Burns World Federation, acted as the editor of the Burns Chronicle and was the president of what became the Robert Burns World Federation. In the upcoming portion, we'll be dissecting life and background to gain a comprehensive understanding of its implications. In 1870, McNaught was approached by Sir William Montgomery Cunningham of Coursehill with a request for assistance with the restoration of the 1600 AD monument to the 7th Earl of Glencairn, his countess and their children that stands in the Glencairn Isle. The crypt beneath the isle was first excavated and portions of the monument were recovered. The monument was extensively restored by Robert Boyd, an employee of Messrs. Boyd and Forrest of Stourton. He had a great interest in history and archaeology. The Crannog at Bwiston, locally known as the Swan Knowe, lay around 70 metres from the northern shore of the Bwiston Crannog and was first identified in December 1880 from worked timbers located within the drainage goat or ditch on the site by Duncan McNaught, who was familiar with the Lochley Crannog site. The Crannog was first excavated in 1880 and more thoroughly in April 1881. In 1921, in recognition of his distinguished services as a parochial school teacher, editor of the Kilmarnock Herald, Burns Chronicle editor and Kilmaurs parish historian, Duncan in 1921 was honoured by the University of Glasgow, which conferred upon him an honorary doctorate of law, and by the Burns Federation, which on 2 occasions presented him with tokens of recognition for services rendered. Duncan was also a Justice of the Peace. In his book 1912 book Kilmaurs Parish and Burgh, Duncan McNaught recorded many local events such as that thanks to the introduction of a gravitation water supply the Marks or Monk's Well had recently been closed up as it was no longer required. In 1921 it is recorded in answer that questions were asked of the Secretary for Scotland in regard of the Education Authority for Scotland refusing to pay the lump sum payable under their superannuation scheme to Duncan and 3 other parochial teachers who had retired after the age of 65. One of the questions read is the Hon. Gentlemen aware that Mr. Duncan McNaught is the greatest living authority on the important subject of the life of Robert Burns, and was it not greatly to the public advantage in Scotland that he should have gone on for this extra number of years teaching the children of Scotland? He died suddenly from a heart attack in 1925. In the upcoming section, we'll be dissecting family and exploring its implications in greater detail. Duncan married Martha Morton, 31 October 1923 and had 6 offspring, Duncan, Jane, George, Denov 1920, John, 13 November 1919, William David, July 1940 and James McGoke, November 1919, who were all born in Kilmaurs, East Ayrshire. Martha died aged 75 and is buried with her husband in Kilmaurs. As we venture forward, let's take a closer look at death and memorials and its impact on our understanding. Duncan died of heart failure at his home, Benrig, in Kilmaurs on 1 June 1925 at the age of 81. The funeral of Duncan was on for June 1925 and he was buried in the Kilmaurs new churchyard. Over 200 people attended his funeral with the cortege passing from his house to the graveside. All business in the village was suspended while the funeral was taking place. Shops were closed and their windows shuttered and the blinds of dwelling houses were drawn. Several flags were flown at half-mast and at a local factory the staff was lined up in front of the building as the funeral procession passed. Little groups of the villagers stood at various points on the route paying homage in respectful silence to the memory of a well-loved teacher and friend. It was a striking and spontaneous tribute. The Burns Federation was represented by Sir Robert Bruce, L.D. President, Mr. Alexander Pollock and Mr. J. Taylor Gibb, Vice Presidents, Mr. Thomas Amos, Hon. Secretary, Major G. A. Innes, Hon. Treasurer, Mr. J. Celsius Ewing, Editor of the Burns Chronicle, and by members of Burns clubs at Kilmarnock, Ayr, Dumfries, Glasgow, and Liverpool. A wreath of flowers sent by the Burns Federation was placed upon the grave by the President. The following are recorded on Duncan and Martha's gravestone in the new cemetery at Kilmaurs. James McNaught died on 13 November 1919, aged 38, and was buried at Old Nebworth Cemetery in Hertfordshire. George Morton McNaught died at Narragansett in Nigeria on 23 November 1920, aged 48. John McNaught died 29 March 1939, aged 64. William David McNaught died on 16 July 1940, aged 61, and was buried at Danhill, Sussex. A gravestone was erected by Duncan McNaught in the Valley of Leban's Bunhill Cemetery near Alexandria to commemorate various members of his family. His mother, Mary McGraw, Duncan his father, his brothers John and Colin and sisters Agnes and Cecilia are all buried in Bunhill Churchyard. The memorial is ornately decorated. A shield in the roundel above his father's name bears a monogram with a D, an M, and a small C for Mac. In the Humours of Ayrshire published by John Aiken, a song is included titled Duncan McNaught with the chorus. Let's now turn our attention to publications and examine its role within the larger context. Duncan privately printed a volume on the charters of Kilmaurs in 1874 and another more substantial volume on the Kilmaurs parish and burgh in 1912 that covered history, geology, flora, fauna, and so on with an informative bespoke map. In 1903 he produced a revised edition of the People's Edition of the Poetical Works of Robert Burns. In 1909 Duncan supervised the publication of a photographic facsimile of an uncut copy in his possession of the Kilmarnock edition of Robert Burns's poems, printed by D. Brown in Kilmarnock. See illustration. In 1911 he edited an edition of Robert Burns's ribald Merry Muses of Caledonia under the auspices of the Robert Burns World Federation, but did not append his name, instead using the term Vindix as in the term Vindicator or simply Editor. 750 copies were officially printed, however many more are thought to have been printed in reality. He also published The Truth About Burns in 1921 that contained an unpublished letter to James Smith from Robert Burns and an extensive bibliography of the appearances of Burns's poems and notices in contemporary periodicals. With our curiosity piqued, let's embark on a dedicated exploration of association with Robert Burns and its fascinating intricacies. In 1885, along with Provost David Mackay and Captain David Snedden, he founded at Kilmarnock the Federation of Burns Clubs, now the Robert Burns World Federation. He was the president for 13 years, from 1910 to 1923. He was the editor of the Robert Burns World Federation's Burns Chronicle from 1893 to 1925, 33 years. He contributed many articles, including one in 1894 in which he denied the possibility that Burns had been involved in any way with the writing of the Merry Muses, although later he was the anonymous editor of an edition published by the Burns Federation. He had very strong opinions on publications that claimed to contain poems written by Burns, and even compiled and printed a list for use by Burnsians. Duncan was a member and president of the Kilmarnock Zero Burns Club, and in 1922 he was made an honorary member of the Irvine Burns Club. He had access to, or owned, many Burns letters and manuscript items that provided many new insights that he published as editor in the Burns Chronicle, such as that it had been thought that Elizabeth Patten had given birth in November 1784 to Elizabeth Bessie Burns, until Duncan was shown a document drawn up by Gavin Hamilton in 1786 that shows Bessie to have been born on 22 May 1785. On the day in 1910 of the unveiling of the Robert Burns Memorial at St Columba's Churchyard, the Stewartenburg Band marched through the streets and Andrew Kerr, president of the Stewarton Literary Society, hosted the proceedings. The whole project had originally begun following a talk delivered by Duncan, and the honour was given to him to unveil the memorial. He not only made a lifelong study of Burns's poems but also was a student of the Ayrshire dialect and was credited by Sir James Wilson, who wrote the dialect of Robert Burns as spoken in central Ayrshire. Let's now shift gears and explore John Gribble through a critical lens, uncovering its strengths and weaknesses. In 1920, the American businessman and antiquarian collector John Gribble visited Duncan's house at Benrig, Kilmaurs, who had been on the Scots committee that sought to take legal action to return the Glenriddle manuscripts to Scotland, a task that became null and void when John Gribble purchased them and gave them to the Scottish people. Duncan presided over the presentation and ceremony at Glasgow's Grand Hotel, 27 July 1920. When John Gribble was able to visit Scotland. Duncan was acknowledged as one of the world's greatest experts on Robert Burns and had put together what John Gribble regarded as being the finest and most extensive collection of Burnsian artifacts, with over 600 publications, owning no less than 2 copies of the Kilmarnock edition, an uncut example of his having alone been valued at £1,000 sterling in circa 1920. John said that he would not leave Ayrshire without these items and made Duncan an offer that was accepted, the amount unknown, on the understanding that they would be kept together under the name the McNaught Collection. Sadly, when John Gribble died in 1936, his estate was broken up and the McNaught Collection sold at auction. One copy of his poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialects, is now held by Cornell University, and the second is at the University of Delaware. A recent estimate is that only 86 copies survive of the 612 Kilmarnock editions that were printed. To recognise Gribble's generosity, the then Burns Federation arranged for a bespoke album, bound in Levant, Morocco, to be created that featured scenes of Burns's life and poems, as well as a historical note outlining the story of the Glenriddle manuscripts. McNaught was the president of the album committee, and the album was presented at a tribute dinner held at Glasgow in 1920. Get ready for an exciting exploration as we unravel the mysteries of the McNaught collection. Duncan had one of the finest and largest collections of Burns-related items in existence at the time, that included 600 volumes, including old magazines from 1780 to 1810, pamphlets and magazines relating to Burns, 20 portraits and engravings of the poet, a number of superb photographs of scenes in the Burns country, and 65 letters from descendants of Burns, 50 of which were from the granddaughter, Mrs. Sarah Burns Hutchinson, and the remainder from Mrs. Burns Scott, Adelaide, Australia, daughter of Mrs. Hutchinson, and from Colonel James Glencairn Burns. The collection included the following copies of rare editions, all published during the poet's lifetime: First Kilmarnock edition, 1786 uncut; First Kilmarnock edition, 1786 cut; First Edinburgh edition with original boards uncut; First London edition with original boards uncut; Edinburgh edition, 1793 2 vols; Edinburgh edition, 1794 uncut; Edinburgh edition, 1794 cut; First Philadelphia edition, 1788; First New York edition; First, Second and Third Belfast editions, 1787, 1790 and 1793; First, Second and Third Dublin editions, 1787, 1789 and 1790, and so on, etc. Now, let's shift our attention to the McKie collection. The James McKie 1816-1891 collection of Burns books, paintings, manuscripts and general Burnsian grew to become one of the world's largest collections of the Bard's published works, with between 600 and 700 volumes and at least one important holograph manuscript. The Kilmarnock Corporation purchased the McKie collection and it was displayed in the Burns Monument Museum in the Earls. Following a fire at the Burns Monument Museum, it is now housed by East Ayrshire Council Arts and Museums Service, and parts of it are viewable online. As we venture forward, let's examine the 1896 Burns exhibition in detail and gain a deeper appreciation for its significance. The Burns exhibition of 1896 was held in the galleries of the Royal Glasgow Institute of the Fine Arts in Glasgow, and McNaught was a member of the executive committee, writing the foreword to the Memorial Catalogues section on Burns relics. In this section, we'll be exploring the Kilmaurs case. Duncan figured in the Kilmaurs case that involved the Reverend Alexander Inglis, minister of Kilmaurs parish, who was accused in 1885 of behaving inappropriately towards Elizabeth McKie Dunlop, the 36-year-old wife of the Kilmaurs miller, John McKie. The events covered the years 1876 to 1884. At first, Quarry House near Kilmaurs Mill was the scene of their accusations. However, by late 1877 the couple had moved to Kilmaurs Place. Elizabeth informed her husband of the minister's approaches, and reluctantly they both wrote letters asking the Rev. Inglis not to call upon them and to desist. Eventually John felt it necessary to employ a Mr. Alexander Morton, a private detective, and in due course a trap was set with the detective hiding in a press or wardrobe in a room occupied also by Elizabeth, into which the minister entered, and upon his inappropriate behaviour taking place the detective revealed himself. The shocked minister threatened suicide and begged for mercy, eventually signing a letter of resignation. Later, however, the minister denied his inappropriate actions and stated that he had been forced to sign the letter under duress. The case was placed before the Presbytery of Ayr and the minister was suspended. After due process, the Presbytery found him guilty on 3 counts. However, he appealed to the Synod, who reversed the decision of the Presbytery, who then took it to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, and here the minister was found not proven on all counts and he was reinstated. Duncan and his wife Martha were close friends of the Mackies and had shared a home on the Isle of Arran for a year. Duncan was a frequent visitor, and an unsuccessful attempt was made by the defence to tarnish Elizabeth's name through suggestions that Duncan had acted with impropriety towards her. If you found this video helpful, give it a like and share it with someone who might benefit from it.